vast nuclear submarine powers through the icy waters of the Arctic. This is the Kursk, the billion-dollar pride of the Russian fleet. Suddenly, an explosion rips through the front of the sub. Seconds later, another massive blast. Catastrophic flooding sends her to the seafloor. But how could this have happened? The Kursk is supposed to be unsinkable. Now we reveal what really took a state-of-the-art nuclear submarine to the bottom of the Barents Sea. Disasters don't just happen. They're triggered by a chain of critical events. Unravel the clues and count down those final seconds from disaster. Northern Europe, Russia, August 10th, 2000. Naval dockyards across the Kola Peninsula are buzzing with preparations for the biggest exercise the Russian Navy has seen since the collapse of communism. Over 30 vessels will be involved, including 6 submarines. It will be a show of strength for a nation under siege. The civil war in Chechnya has taken a new and menacing turn, with a spate of suicide attacks across Russia. The entire country is on edge, and this exercise aims to restore confidence in the Federation's power. 9 p.m. The submarine Kursk is undergoing final engineering checks in the highly restricted Zapadnaya Lista Naval Dockyard. Created to attack American aircraft carrier battle groups, she's at the cutting edge of Russia's defenses. Powered by 2 nuclear reactors, she's 492 feet long and as tall as a 6-story building, more than twice the size of a jumbo jet. The Kursk's unique double-skinned hull and 9 watertight compartments mean that she can take a direct hit from a torpedo and survive. Lieutenant Captain Dmitry Kolesnikov is enjoying a final cigarette before boarding the Kursk. This is Dmitry's 27th birthday, and he's missing his new wife. Olga and Dmitry were married only 4 months ago.
Our wedding was in April 2000. It was very modest because we were in a hurry.
Soon after they were married, Dmitry gave his new wife a tour of the Kursk. He wanted Olga to feel the same confidence in the submarine that he did.
I did not expect a submarine to be so enormous.
The tour goes through the torpedo room. Next is the command center. Toward the back of the boat, Dmitry shows Olga the propulsion control station, where he's section captain. When she gets to some of the Kursk's most unusual features, a sauna and a swimming pool, Olga can see why Dmitry is so happy on the Kursk.
I could see she had a right to be loved.
The sub has 2 escape hatches and an escape pod big enough to evacuate the entire crew all at once. Olga is satisfied that Dmitry is on board one of the safest submarines in the Navy's history. 9:30 p.m. Dmitry rejoins his crew. Although this mission will be a 5-day exercise, the Kursk and her crew are always prepared for real combat, and the sub is loaded with weapons. 24 cruise missiles are stored in silos on each side of the fin. And in the Kursk bow is the torpedo room. There are 6 torpedo tubes and space for 24 torpedoes. The crew is joined by Mamed Gadjev, a torpedo engineer on board to monitor some experimental torpedo batteries. Gadjev is from Dagestan, which borders the troubled Chechen region. At 10:30 p.m., in the half-light of an Arctic summer evening, the Kursk sets out to sea. Friday, August 11th, in the Barents Sea, 85 miles from shore, the naval exercise is in full swing. The Kursk will take part in a simulated attack, with Russian ships substituting for the Americans. Her commander is Captain Gennady Lyachin, a product of the Soviet system and one of the Navy's most experienced men. 2 p.m. The crew prepares to launch a cruise missile. Their target is Peter the Great, the flagship of the Northern Fleet. In the cash-starved Russian Navy, it's unusual to fire a real missile, and the men are nervous. Russia has a secret history of accidents with these weapons. In 1989, the submarine Komsomolets developed a fuel fire in a missile silo. An emergency blow brought the sub to the surface, but her nuclear reactors were shut down. Helpless without power, the fire destroyed the sub, and she sank, killing 41 sailors. With the safe launch of the missile, the Kursk melts back into the ocean. She can stay hidden beneath the waves virtually indefinitely, thanks to her nuclear heart. In control of the reactors is Alexei Mityayev. This is his first mission on the Kursk, but despite his lack of experience, Alexei is well aware of his responsibilities. If there's any sign of an emergency, he'll have to seal himself in his compartment to share the same fate as the reactors. Saturday, August 12th, day 2. The Kursk is ready to begin the final phase of her mission. She'll fire 2 practice torpedoes at the enemy battle group. It's now 11 a.m. The commander gives the order to prepare torpedo tube number 4 for launch. The crew is excited. The Kursk hasn't launched a torpedo for nearly 2 years. This practice torpedo is 25 inches wide, 36 feet long, and weighs 5 tons. Like all practice torpedoes, there's no warhead on the front, just a dummy weight to balance the weapon. 11:08 a.m. The commander has decided to make his attack from close to the surface. He looks for enemy ships and spots the distant target. Satisfied it's Peter the Great, he can proceed with his plan. He orders a single sonar pulse to calculate the target's distance. The battle group will be fired on by 6 subs as it passes through the exercise area. The Kursk is second in line. 11:17. The commander gives the order to slow to 6 knots. The instructions are passed to the rear of the sub, where in propulsion control, Dmitry Kolesnikov knows that such a slow speed means the commander is firing a torpedo. 11:20. The torpedo is finally slid into position. As the torpedo door closes, an electrical connection is made between the torpedo and a monitoring system. At 11:27 and 30 seconds, the commander takes a final look in the periscope. The Kursk is poised to launch the first of her torpedoes at the enemy battle group. A shock wave bursts through the command center. The crew is slammed to the floor. Toxic smoke pours into the room. The Kursk is surrounded by about 100 tons of high explosives, 24 cruise missiles, and 2 nuclear reactors. The Kursk is seconds from nuclear disaster. And now back to seconds from disaster. An explosion tears through the torpedo room of the giant Russian submarine, Kursk. The blast reverberates down the length of the boat. Though seriously injured, the captain has to get the ship to the surface as quickly as possible. He orders his crew to perform an emergency blow, but no one can respond. 230 feet from the source of the explosion, in the reactor control room, Alexei's training kicks in. First, he checks to see if the reactors have been damaged. He quickly sees that both reactors are working normally. For now. Alexei knows that the reactors are separated from the hull by powerful shock absorbers and can withstand a jolt of 50 times that of normal gravity. But if the Kursk's massive arsenal explodes, the shock absorbers will be useless. The Kursk could become the biggest dirty bomb in history. Alexei seals himself into his compartment. He desperately tries to reach the command post, but there's no response. Further to the rear of the sub, in propulsion control, Dmitry shouts for checks on all systems. But something is seriously wrong. Why doesn't he feel the upward surge of an emergency blow? Back in reactor control, Alexei faces a terrible dilemma. He has to deliver maneuvering power to the commander, but he must also be prepared to shut down the reactors to avoid nuclear catastrophe. The wrong decision will put the entire crew in jeopardy. In the command post, the air has become superheated and poisonous. The commander and most of the men are dead. With no word from the commander, Alexei braces himself to shut down the reactors. 11:30. Just minutes after the first explosion, another detonation rips through the front of the Kursk. Alexei makes his decision, but it might be too late. Control rods slam into the reactor cores, and the nuclear reactors shut down. Dmitry and his men lie where they have fallen and wait for the inevitable impact on the seabed. "20 seconds since the explosion. 25 miles away, Admiral Popov, commander of the Northern Fleet, is on board Peter the Great observing the torpedo exercises. A massive shockwave passes through the ship. Sonar specialist Lieutenant Lavriniuk logs the location of the source of the shockwave. "11:31. Dmitry Kolesnikov and his crewmates are amazed that they're alive. But could the reactors still blow? Dmitry immediately asks about the state of the reactors. To his relief, he learns that they're safely locked down. The nuclear threat is over. But Dmitry and his men now face a desperate fight for survival. Although only 27, Dmitry Kolesnikov assumes command. The men know from the scale of the damage that they won't be able to reach the escape pod in the fin. The only way out is through the rear escape hatch at the back of the submarine. "1:15 p.m. Aboard Peter the Great, Admiral Popov considers an unexpected turn of events in the exercise. 5 of the 6 submarines have reported successful missions. Only the Kursk is silent. Admiral Popov doesn't raise the alarm yet. The Kursk is, after all, unsinkable. 1:30 p.m. 2 hours since the explosions. A sailor beats out the special hammering code that'll signal their position to rescuers. Meanwhile, Dmitry Kolesnikov calls for the men to yell out their names and writes them down. He begins to log the events that have brought the men to compartment 9. 11:30 p.m. 12 hours after the Kursk was ripped apart by 2 explosions, the Russian fleet finally declares an emergency. A full-scale search and rescue operation begins, and the Navy submarine rescue squad is scrambling. But it won't be easy to find the Kursk. Her outer hull is covered in a 2.5-inch thick layer of rubber, which absorbs sonar pulses, making her almost impossible to detect. At 4:30 in the morning, after a 5-hour search, the Kursk is finally located by Peter the Great's sonar operator. Monday, August 14th. Across Russia, news is leaking out about a submarine disaster.
Towards the end of the day, I realized that there had been a tragedy. We were thinking of which hospital to take him to. We were preparing warm clothes, getting hold of medicine, as everyone wanted to help.
3 rescue subs are now on the sea, but they're in poor condition with inexperienced crews. The submersibles tried to connect with the Kursk, but none of them can make a watertight seal with a rear escape hatch. The Russian Navy's attempt to rescue the men is a total failure, and the whole world is following the events in the Barents Sea.
Thank you very much, Brian. Good morning.
Under growing international pressure, the Russians ask a joint Norwegian and British team to launch a rescue mission. At 7:45 a.m. on Monday, August 21st, 9 days after she sank, divers finally managed to open the Kursk's outer escape hatch. At the other end of the 6-foot-long chamber is the hatch into compartment 9. After such a long time, could anyone still be alive, trapped in an air pocket in the stern of the wreck? Seconds from Disaster will continue in a moment. You're watching Seconds from Disaster. Could anyone have survived the tragic sinking of one of Russia's largest and most advanced submarines? As rescuers grapple with the inner door of the rear escape hatch, the world waits with bated breath. But when they open the lower hatch, they find the submarine is flooded. All 118 men are dead. The first body to be recovered is Dmitry Kolesnikov. A note is found in his pocket. It includes the list of the 23 men who survived the blast, only to die in compartment 9. And it contains his farewell to his wife.
It is dark in here to write, but I'll try by feel. It seems that there are no chances, maybe 10, 20%. Let's hope that at least someone will read this. Regards to everybody. No need to be desperate.
But how could the supposedly unsinkable Kursk be destroyed? What crisis developed so quickly that the crew couldn't bring the submarine to the surface? And why did no one manage to escape? Now, by rewinding the events of that day and by going deep into the investigation, we can reveal what really happened to the Kursk and her crew. Advanced computer simulation will take us where no camera can, into the heart of the disaster zone. The fiasco of the Russian rescue attempt shocks the world. But for those with an intimate knowledge of how Russia works, the reaction is very different.
I was getting increasingly angry, really. I knew the attitude of the Russian military which was always to protect its image.
In 2000, Lord Truscott is the British government's special advisor on the Russian Federation. Married to a Russian, he has high-level connections in both Russia and the West. Truscott sees that the Russian Navy is looking both incompetent and vulnerable and expects the worst.
I was thinking that a cover-up was entirely possible.
The official Russian investigation begins in secret, and Lord Truscott knows that its findings probably won't be made public. So he begins his own investigation, knowing full well it won't be easy.
If you go to the Russian military and say, tell me exactly what happened with your nuclear submarine, then they'll just blank you. In fact, there's even a danger that you could be accused of espionage.
Utilizing his unique contacts, Truscott begins to sift through what little information he can find.
I considered all theories that came forward, and I looked at every one.
2 days after the catastrophe, Lord Truscott is presented with a chilling possibility: terrorism. A Chechen news agency claims that a crewman blew up both the Kursk and himself in support of Muslim fighters in Chechnya.
There were Russian soldiers being killed in Chechnya at the time. People were thinking about Chechen terrorism. So when the Kursk went down, people thought, could this possibly be a terrorist attack?
But who would have had access to the bow of the submarine? And who would have been motivated to plant a bomb? There were 2 men on board from Russia's Muslim territories, and one had access to the torpedo room. Mohammad Gadjev comes under intense scrutiny. Truscott discovers that Gadjev had volunteered for the job of monitoring the torpedo batteries, positioning him right at the front of the sub. Could Gadjev have been a suicide bomber? Truscott uses his high-level contacts to check him out.
These were people working with highly secret weapons. When I did look into the background of Mohammad Gadjev, he was a good, loyal member of the Navy. There was no reason to think that this was any kind of planned terrorist operation.
It's clear that Gadjev's presence on the Kursk has been exploited as easy propaganda. Terrorism is ruled out. But the mystery still needs to be solved. Then the Russian Navy starts to promote another theory about what sank the Kursk: a collision with a foreign submarine. The Northern Fleet wasn't alone in the Barents Sea at the time of the Kursk's disappearance. At least 2 NATO submarines were spying on the Russian exercise. And Truscott discovers that this game of cat and mouse regularly ends with an unintentional underwater impact. The Russian Navy has documented 25 cases of submarine collisions since 1967. Truscott's special contacts tell him that even the British Navy thinks a collision is what sank the Kursk.
The first thing that they thought was the Kursk has probably hit an American submarine in the Barents Sea and gone down.
But there's no hard evidence. Then, the Russian Navy publishes a satellite photograph of a U.S. submarine, the USS Memphis, in a Norwegian military dockyard, taken only 7 days after the Kursk sinks. For the Russians, it's evidence that the sub has been damaged. U.S. officials deny that the Memphis had been involved in any collision.
That there were no American ships involved.
The Russian Navy isn't so dismissive. They call a press conference and show video footage of what looks like a large gash down the side of the Kursk. They insist it's evidence of a collision. If not the Memphis, then maybe a British sub is responsible. The Kursk is becoming a political hot potato, and the British Ministry of Defense feels obligated to look into the collision theory. If NATO submarines are being blamed, they need to know the truth. Stay tuned for more Seconds from Disaster. We now return to Seconds from Disaster. Russia claims that a collision with a NATO sub caused the Kursk to sink, and the British Ministry of Defense is investigating the allegation. Then, a Norwegian seismic facility announces that a strange seismic event occurred in the Barents Sea at the approximate time of the Kursk's disappearance. Could this echo of the Kursk's explosions contain evidence for a collision? The British government obtains this crucial data and sends it to expert seismologist David Bowers.
The amount of information in these seismograms is remarkable.
Bowers compares the shape of the event to a database of other seismic signals. It doesn't match the distinctive pattern of an earthquake or a collision, but it does match the patterns of known underwater explosions exactly.
The explosion was very large, it's equivalent to about 5 tons of TNT.
Bowers continues to examine the trace. He moves backwards in time. Here, just a couple minutes earlier, he finds another seismic event almost invisible in the background noise. It's 100 times smaller than the second event, but still powerful enough to be picked up 250 miles away. Could the Russian Navy be right after all? Could this seismic trace represent a collision which somehow triggered the second massive explosion? Bowers analyzes the shape of the first event. When he expands its size to match the second, bigger event, he sees the evidence he's been looking for.
When we compared the signals from the second event with the first event, we found they were remarkably similar. And this suggested to us that the first signals were also from an underwater explosion. The first explosion was probably about 100th the size of the second, namely about 50 kilograms.
Bowers has no doubt that both the seismic anomalies are the result of underwater explosions. NATO is off the hook, and the Russian Navy has to accept that an underwater collision is not the cause of the Kursk disaster. Investigators now have to explain the two explosions that Bowers uncovered.
We knew that there were 2 explosions, but it was very frustrating because the physical evidence lay at the bottom of the Barents Sea out of reach.
As the political fallout of the disaster mounts, President Putin authorizes a radical salvage plan. The Kursk will be raised from the seabed. This will be one of the most ambitious maritime salvages in history. But will it supply the investigation with the breakthrough it needs? Putin allocates $130 million to the task, more than the annual budget for the entire northern submarine fleet. The salvage team cuts off the Kursk's shadowed torpedo room, afraid it will fall apart if they move it. Then they slowly raise the rest of the sub to the surface. 14 months after she sank, the Kursk arrives at a secret naval dockyard on the Kola Peninsula. Investigators take 4 days to drain her, careful to preserve the evidence she contains. Forensic specialists get to work on the immense wreck. The first challenge is to identify the cause of devastation that surrounds them. They quickly establish that all the crew's missiles are intact, so their attention turns to the Kursk's torpedo arsenal. Although the torpedo room has been left on the seabed, by analyzing the distribution of damage on the remaining wreck, they deduce that between 5 and 7 torpedoes exploded at virtually the same time. This corresponds to the 5-ton blast predicted by the seismic data. Truscott is confident that the cause of the second killer blast has been identified. But what led to this massive detonation in the Kursk's arsenal? The clues must also lie in the tortured remains of the sub. The forensic team establishes that the front section of the wreck has been incinerated, its contents cooked in a fire measuring 3,600 degrees Fahrenheit, as hot as a blast furnace. Detailed analysis reveals that this fire was raging before the torpedo arsenal exploded. And Truscott realizes that the seismic data has already revealed the likely source of this fire. The first small explosion. Discovering the cause of this initial blast is the big question for the investigation. But with the remains of the front of the sub abandoned on the sea floor, Truscott doubts the critical evidence will ever be recovered.
How could you unravel all this when the whole torpedo compartment had been blown to smithereens over the seabed? The investigation was in big trouble.
But then, a piece of hull debris from around the number 4 torpedo hatch is found 165 feet behind the main wreckage site. For this piece of hull to be found in this strange location, way behind the rest of the sub debris, means that it was the very first thing to be blown off the sub, and its original position on the Kursk indicates the spot where the blast happened.
This was sensational evidence because it proved that the torpedo in Tube 4 was the first thing to explode, and the only question was which part of the torpedo had exploded.
Truscott knows that the most obvious candidate for an explosion is the torpedo's warhead, but he discovers that the Kursk was about to fire a practice torpedo, which has no warhead. So something else in the torpedo must be to blame. When torpedoes are launched, they can travel many miles before reaching their target, which means that their propulsion systems often contain more energy than the warhead itself. Truscott looks into the details of the practice torpedo's propulsion system. The turbine that pushes the torpedo through the water gets its power from burning kerosene. But underwater, where there's no air, the oxygen needed to react with the fuel is stored in the form of concentrated hydrogen peroxide, or HTP. On paper, this propulsion system is efficient and foolproof. But Truscott discovers that HTP has some disturbing properties. When certain metals or even rust come into contact with HTP, they act as a catalyst. The hydrogen peroxide breaks down into oxygen, steam, and a lot of heat. The volume of gas increases 5,000 times in a split second. In a torpedo, this can be a deadly force.
I was amazed to discover that HTP torpedoes were extremely dangerous, especially if they weren't handled properly.
Truscott uncovers a series of naval accidents involving HTP. The most infamous happened in 1955 on a British sub, the HMS Sidon. During routine weapons loading, one of her new HTP torpedoes exploded in the launch tube, killing 13 men.
The lesson of HMS Sidon was that the world's navy should abandon HTP, and that was learnt by everyone, but not by the Soviet Union.
Could the Kursk be another victim of this chemical time bomb? Former Russian sub-commander Igor Kordin examines the possibility that an HTP propulsion system could be at the root of the Kursk disaster. He begins by calculating the likely explosive yield of the propulsion system. The result is in the region of 220 pounds of TNT, roughly the same size as the first explosion on the seismic trace. With the numbers stacking up, an HTP accident looks increasingly likely. But Kordin knows that all HTP torpedoes have safety features aimed at preventing dangerous pressurization inside the torpedo. Could the torpedo's safety systems have been damaged? Kordin uses his special contacts to obtain the maintenance records of the Kursk's practice torpedo, and he uncovers some shocking news. The torpedo came from a batch of 10 made in 1990. 6 of these were immediately rejected because of faulty welding. He's told that the welding on the practice torpedo was never checked because it didn't have a warhead. Igor Kordin concludes that shoddy welding probably allowed HTP to leak out of the practice torpedo with devastating consequences. But where is the proof? A painstaking search from the thousands of metal fragments recovered from the Kursk eventually pays off. Parts of both the torpedo and the launch tube are found with distortions and heat damage that are consistent with the torpedo exploding about halfway down its length, right by a critical weld. But the elaborate HTP theory raises more questions than it answers. First, Truscott knows that the torpedo launch tubes are designed to fail-safe. The inner door is 3 times stronger than the outer door, so an explosion inside the tube should be directed into the sea, not into the sub. The second problem is that the relatively small size of the HTP explosion shouldn't have been able to penetrate the bulkhead that separates the command post from the torpedo room. Igor Kordin.
This was a mystery to us. The yield of the first wave was enough for those people in the second compartment to be left unconscious.
The only way these paradoxes can be resolved is to revisit the Kursk's rusting hulk. The exhausted forensic team eventually finds the inner launch tube door embedded in the first bulkhead, 40 feet from its original position. Examination of the door reveals that although it was closed at the time of the explosion, it wasn't fully locked down, compromising its strength. With his years of experience, Kordin realizes why the door could have been unlocked. The electrical connection between the torpedo and the tube door is notorious for getting clogged with dust. The crew often has to open the tube door several times to clean the connection before they can complete their system checks. Kordin thinks that pure bad luck means the door is only partially closed when the HTP reaction ruptures the torpedo. This leaves the investigation with one outstanding problem. How did this small explosion manage to knock out the command post, leaving the Kursk helpless?
It was clear that the HTP torpedo was the cause of the first blast, but why was that powerful enough to overcome the command post and stop the Kursk from saving itself?
An emergency blow takes just seconds to implement, but even this most basic emergency procedure didn't happen.
It really was perplexing.
The answer to this mystery will send shockwaves through the Russian fleet and ultimately shed new light on the terrible fate of Dmitry and his 22 comrades. We'll continue with more Seconds from Disaster in a moment. We now return to Seconds from Disaster. Shoddy welding has led to a torpedo explosion in the front compartment of the Kursk. The bulkhead should have contained the blast, but it didn't. Once again, Truscott consults expert submariner Igor Kordin. Kordin knows that the bulkhead separating the first 2 compartments should have been strong enough to contain the first explosion in the torpedo room. So he starts to look for potential weak spots in the design of the front part of the submarine. His suspicions quickly turn to the ventilation system. A ventilation duct carries air in a circuit that covers the first 4 compartments. 1 foot in diameter and made of a light alloy, the duct penetrates the reinforced bulkheads.
It's just a usual ventilation pipe, just like in a house or in an office. When the explosion happened, the ventilation pipe burst immediately.
The pressure wave from the first explosion traveled down this duct and exploded into the command post, shattering the ducting and feeding flame and smoke into the compartment.
Before they can even press the emergency alarm, they're overcome by the fire, smoke. It's total wipeout.
Lord Truscott can now put together the chain of events that left this Russian super sub and her crew seconds from disaster. August 12th, 2000. 5 minutes and 30 seconds to disaster. The Kursk prepares to launch a practice torpedo at Peter the Great. As the commander maneuvers the Kursk, the torpedo in the front of the sub is leaking HTP into the launch tube, and a puddle of HTP forms. The torpedo crew opens the tube to clean the electrical connection. 2 minutes and 15 seconds to disaster. The liquid contacts a patch of rust and instantly expands 5,000 times in volume. The pressure spike shatters the torpedo casing and splits the kerosene tank. Superheated steam ignites the kerosene, which burns the free oxygen, and a fireball fills the torpedo room, killing the men instantly. The blast wave bursts through the ventilation pipe into the command center. As seawater jets in through the launch tube, the Kursk begins a gentle dive. Now there are 21 torpedoes being cooked in a fire fueled by 1,100 pounds of kerosene. As the internal temperature of the warheads reaches 700 degrees Fahrenheit, they will spontaneously explode. 11:30 and 15 seconds. Catastrophe. In less than a fifth of a second, up to 7 torpedoes explode. The supersonic blast slices through the Kursk's watertight bulkheads and hurtles towards the nuclear reactors. But the reactor shock absorbers cushion the 50G acceleration. The bulkheads contain the blast wave. Control rods slam into the reactor cores, stopping the nuclear chain reactions. Meanwhile, at the front of the sub, the pressure hull is stressed way beyond its limits. The 2-inch thick steel tube bursts. Water explodes into the boat through the 230-foot-long hole. Just minutes after the first explosion, the pride of the Russian fleet lies a wreck on the muddy Barents Sea floor, a watery tomb for 118 men. With the recovery of the bodies, pathologists conclude that for most of the sailors, the end was swift, but not for the 23 men at the rear of the sub. They clung to life for up to 8 hours after the explosions. Igor Kordin uses a lifetime of experience to create the full horrific account of their struggle for survival. The men are only 118 yards below the surface, and they've been trained to ascend from this depth in their escape suits, one by one through the hatch. But it's dangerous. If no one spots them when they reach the surface, they'll freeze to death.
To go up into the open sea, they'd be carried out into the open ocean, get frozen, and get lost without a trace. They were waiting for one ship to be above the submarine.
The sailors have plenty of food and water, and there's enough air in the compartment to last several days if they're careful. But each time the men breathe out, they exhale carbon dioxide. Even at low concentrations, this toxic gas can kill. To counteract this threat, the sub is fitted with air scrubbers, chemical plates designed to strip the CO2 out of the air. In the thickening atmosphere, the sailors hang the scrubbers from the pipes. Kordin discovers that the sailors' fate is linked to these life-saving devices. The forensic report describes evidence of a fire in compartment 9, and air scrubber cartridges are found in the fire debris. Kordin knows that these cartridges explode into a vicious chemical fire if they come into contact with oil or water. A dreadful picture of the sailors' last moments is forming. The men are hanging up another cartridge, but in the cold darkness, they become clumsy. The cartridge falls into the oily water. The chemical reaction starts a fire. This sucks oxygen out of the air, leaving the men to breathe in carbon monoxide from the flames. Death follows quickly.
You know, on one hand, I am proud of Mitya, because in such terrible circumstances, Mitya was able to pull himself together and not lose control over himself and others. But on the other hand, I think this kind of death is a hellish death. I think if it's time to die, let the death be instant.
In the wake of the disaster, the Navy removes all HTP torpedoes from Russian submarines. But the official report finds no individual is to blame. No one will ever know for sure if nuclear technician Alexei Mityayev shut down their reactors. If he did, then his heroic action may have prevented another Chernobyl. Most of the sailors' bodies are returned to their families across Russia, and a memorial is created in St. Petersburg to honor them.
The Kursk disaster is often seen as a metaphor for the decay of the Soviet Union, but I see the bravery of the Russian crew really as a sign of hope for Russia.